Fromm with the Canadian Association for Free Expression. I'm recording this late in October, just before Halloween. It's a very, very important month, November, coming up for free speech battles up here in the Dominion of Canada. Two very, very important cases. The first is the Mark Lemire case. Now, if you're an internet person, you've probably heard of Mark. Mark has been involved in a 10-year battle with a man named Richard Warman. This battle has involved freedom of speech on the internet. Way back in about 2005, Mark was the subject of a complaint by Richard Warman under a piece of legislation that's now defunct. That was Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. And that made it a discriminatory practice to communicate over the internet material that was likely to expose to hatred or contempt a long list of privileged groups, you know, homosexuals, visible minorities, etc. The complaint wasn't about anything Mark had written. It was about a number of articles written by other people. One of them is probably something you've seen. It's been around the coffee cooler for probably 30 years. It's called The Immigrant Song. It's a kind of silly poem about people coming from Pakistan. They can't believe how good things are in this country, the welfare, that you get paid to have children, and all those things. And in the end, the final punchline is, if you don't like it here in Canada, plenty of room in Pakistan for that. Anyway, it's kind of been around a long time. Anyway, that was one of the grounds of the complaint, a satirical poem. In the end, Mark Lemire was the very first person to win under this very biased piece of legislation. He won. He was acquitted on the 2nd of September 2009. Well, the Canadian Human Rights Commission appealed, or they sought judicial review in federal court. The judgment had been, at the tribunal level, that the law was unconstitutional. In federal court, the judge said, well, the penalties, that's fines, etc., were unconstitutional, but the law itself was not. Even though truth was not a defense, intent was not a defense. In fact, there really weren't any defenses other than I didn't publish it. That was in 2011. Mark has appealed, and that is the appeal that will be heard on November the 14th in Toronto in the Federal Court of Appeals on 120 Queen Street West. It's very important for two reasons. That's the basic principle of freedom of speech, and that law trampled it. Now, in the meantime, Parliament repealed it. So you might say, well, isn't this all kind of academic? The law's repealed, it won't hurt anybody else. Why are you continuing to fight? And the fight, of course, is very costly. It's been costly for Mark. It's been costly for those of us who have intervened on Mark's behalf, like the Canadian Association for Free Expression. The reason that we don't want to give this fight up is this. If another government came to power, like a Liberal government or an NDP government, if the law is not being ruled unconstitutional, they could bring it back. And I've listened to the Senate debates, and if you're really a bear for punishment, you might want to get onto the Senate website and check out the debates over something called Bill C-304. Bill C-304 was the motion of the House of Commons to repeal Section 13, and it was then debated in the Senate and finally passed the Senate this past June. Why am I asking you to look at those debates if you're a bear for punishment? Because you will see a lot of senators, Liberal senators, very much in favor of this type of legislation, very much of the belief that vulnerable minorities, that's what they call them, even though these are some of the most powerful and richest groups in the country, need protection. They need special protection. Why? Your criticism of them might so wound them that that type of criticism has to be silenced. Don't forget, truth is no defense. When I used to talk to audiences about this before this law became better known, people would say, well, as long as what you say is true, that's okay, right? No. Truth is no defense. It's the impact of the words. So this is an important battle. It's a battle that has to be fought. So if you're in Toronto, or like to come to Toronto, it'll be 10 o'clock Thursday morning, the 14th of November, in the Federal Court of Appeals on Queen Street. An important date. Hope you'll be able to be down there to join us. The second free speech case that's going to be in court, ironically, on the same dates, on the 13th and 14th of November in St. John, New Brunswick, is something that's called the McCorkle will case. Now, at first you might think, well, what does a will have to do with freedom of speech? Well, a fellow named McCorkle was a chemistry professor, and he left his collection of rare coins and artifacts, worth, depending on who you take as worth, between $250,000 and $1 million. Anyway, that's a fairly substantial sum of money. He left it to an American right-wing group called the National Alliance. It took 9 years for the will to be probated, but it was probated in May of this year. That is, the court in New Brunswick verified that it was all legit, that the late Professor McCorkle had been in his right mind, etc., and so on. Then an American group called Southern Poverty Law Center decided that they opposed the will. They didn't like the National Alliance. They thought it was an extreme group. They didn't like its views, and they thought that the will should not be allowed to go through. Well, of course, they don't really have standing in Canada, but they developed some allies in Ottawa. One of them was a man I've already mentioned, Richard Warman. He put out a statement that it was terrible to give money to such a group as the National Alliance, and that the will should be overturned. Then along came the long-lost sister, or I should say strange sister, of late Robert McCorkle. That's a woman in Ottawa named Isabel McCorkle. Apparently she hadn't gone to the funeral. It's not even sure she knew he was dead. And she said that the bequest to the National Alliance was bad, and it should be overturned. The next thing you know, for partisan reasons, 2 other groups intervene. These are the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith, a Jewish group, and also the Center for Jewish and Israel Affairs, and also obviously a Jewish group, and the Attorney General of New Brunswick. And what they're arguing basically is that because the National Alliance is right-wing, or they even say it's white supremacist, whatever that is, that the bequest is contrary to public policy. Now, this is the scary part. Traditionally, in this country, the courts are very reluctant to interfere with a will. The only exception, really, is if a person has neglected their obligations. I'll give you the example. Let's say a man has a wife and 2 small children, but he leaves all of his money to his mistress, leaving the wife and 2 small children in poverty. The courts will overturn that because the wife and the children have a claim on his estate. But other than extraordinary circumstances like that, the courts are being reluctant to second-guess someone. And we can imagine any number of cases where we would say, I think the man should have done something different with his money. For instance, he should have given it to the food bank instead of his ne'er-do-well drunken brother. But we've taken the view generally that's up to the individual. This is a matter of private property. It's also a matter of keeping the state out of people's business and out of people's affairs, because the sky's the limit. There are all sorts of things that are contrary to public policy. For instance, Canada has abortion on demand, but there are many people who feel strongly that abortion's wrong. What if somebody gives a bequest to a right-to-life group? Their views are, in a sense, contrary to public policy. Should that will be overturned? This is a big fight, and CAFE is intervening on behalf of the estate. So both of these are cases to watch, both coming up in November. If you'd like to help, send your contribution to CAFE. That's the Canadian Association for Free Expression. But boil it down at CAFE. Mailing address is Box 332, Rexdale. That's Rexdale, Ontario. postal code is M9W5L3. This is Paul Fromm for Freedom.